episode 35 today of our weekly CRICKETher Vodcast. And today, as our backdrop, we are joining Berkshire in a post-match huddle after they lost to Middlesex.
Boo.
And that is because we are today in solidarity with Syd for never quite managing to back the winning horse. Talking of which, how's the WBBL going for the Hobart Hurricanes, Syd?
Well, the Hurricanes beat the Sydney Sixers. And I think that's the only thing that's happened in WBBL in the last week. I don't think there's any more WBBL news, just the Hurricanes beating the Sixers. So moving swiftly on, Raf.
Nothing happened overnight.
No.
UK time. Nobody getting bowled out for 82 by the Heat. No, it doesn't.
Fake
doesn't
news.
Ring a bell.
Fake news.
Cool. So on that note, let's look at the real news. What are the WBBL standings as they currently appear?
Well, the Melbourne Stars are very much on top, but they did actually have a shock loss overnight. We had first v last overnight, the Stars v the Renegades, and the Renegades pulled off a big win, and then the Super over.
Yes,
so it was
very
certainly
exciting.
super for the Renegades. But the Stars are still very much on top. They've got 15 points. And then we've got the Perth Scorchers on 12 points.
Yes.
The RAF-backed Perth Scorchers.
Oh, it was only a matter of time. They're just charging up their way to eventual victory.
And then we've got 3 teams on 10 points. So we've got the Brisbane Heat, the Sydney Thunder and the Sydney Sixers all on 10 points. So that takes us outside the qualification zone, kind of. But, you know, all still very much in it. The Heat are actually ahead on net run rate there. And we've got the Adelaide Strikers on 9 points. So we've only got 1 point, celebrating what? Third and sixth. So Hobart Hurricanes with 8 points, or 7th, and then the Melbourne Renegades. Now the Melbourne Renegades have got 6 points. I haven't worked out actually all the permutations, but it looks to me like the Melbourne Renegades could still qualify for the finals and therefore could still win it.
So what you're saying is that we're a few weeks into WBBL and it's still anyone's competition.
Yeah, there's going to be a mad charge this week. So there's 4 games left for everybody. Mad charge this week to reach those 4 qualification spots, and then we'll be into the semi-finals and finals. So exciting times at WBBL.
Absolutely. Now, unfortunately, we have seen a couple of injuries this week, haven't we? To Susie Bates and Sophie Devine.
Yeah, Susie Bates, she already had 1 injury, so she came into the series between New Zealand and Australia, got injured. She came back this week, and then almost immediately, you know, her shoulder was playing up again and she had to go. I understand that she's having scans and they're still not absolutely sure where they are with that. And also Sophie Devine overnight. And that's Sophie Devine left the field after bowling. Looks to have a back injury. We don't know too much more about that at this stage. But that's not great news for the Scorchers, is it, Raf?
No, it's not, unfortunately. Now, I think that my overall prediction about backing the Scorchers because of that kind of mouth-watering opening partnership between Sophie Devine and Beth Mooney has actually come to pass, because between them they've scored, what was it we were doing the calculation, 65% of the Scorchers' runs, which is a huge percentage, and that therefore means that if by any chance they do lose Sophie Devine, whether it just be for a couple of games or whether for the rest of the tournament, they could be in real trouble, because, as you say, the standings are still very tight at the moment, and nobody can afford to sit back and relax even if they are currently in second place. So
yeah, even the Stars can't afford to sit back and relax yet. They could the top Stars could definitely still technically not qualify at this point. So yeah, all to play for.
Absolutely.
It's going to be an exciting week, so keep a good eye on that one.
Are we a bit concerned about these injuries? Is that partly to do with the way that the tournament's been structured this year?
Well, it is very intense, isn't it? But what do you think? I mean, is it just coincidence that we've had those 2 New Zealand players have been 2 key injuries, or?
You'd think in some ways that actually the New Zealand players going into the WBBL are better prepared than many of the other overseas players in terms of having played international cricket much more recently and also been able to train much more regularly than some of the other teams. So I'm not convinced there's really anything particularly going on other than perhaps the fact that the tournament they've condensed it very much, haven't they? So all the matches are happening over a bit of a shorter time period than they usually would. And we've heard people talking about, or coaches talking about, the fact that a lot of the training sessions have been made voluntary. over the past week or so because of the matches happening so thick and fast now. And therefore they're concerned presumably about player workload, especially for somebody like Sophie Devine, who opens the batting and takes on she normally bowls her full allocation of overs, I think, as well, and she's a fast bowler, so there's an awful lot of workload to manage for somebody like her, and so that is a bit of a concern. But then again, they couldn't really have structured it any other way, could they, in these COVID times? It was have a full WBBL, a kind of meaningful length WBBL and condense it a bit, or don't have a WBBL at all, or maybe a very shortened version of a WBBL, which would have felt like a step backwards given the progress that seems to be being made with it year on year as a competition. So I think that the approach they've gone for is probably the right one. It's just unfortunate for those players who then suffer potential quite serious injuries. We don't know about Sophie Devine. Fingers crossed that she's back fighting fit for the next game. I've certainly got my Perth Scorchers orange supporting fingers crossed. Now the other game that we saw this week, or the denouement, it was of the T20 Challenge in the UAE, between the Supernovas and the Trailblazers, and the Trailblazers ended up winning. It was a bit of a low-scoring game because they only made 118, but they won in the end by 16 runs, didn't they? What did you make of that match, Syd? Because we were lucky enough to be able to watch that, weren't we?
Yeah, it wasn't a great game, was it? I think what it really emphasised was how much Smriti Mandhana is just like a quality player above all else, that it obviously was a difficult pitch to score runs on. It says it all that Harmanpreet was the next highest scorer. I mean, let's look at the scoreboard, and we see that Smriti was 68 off 49 balls. The next highest score was Harman's 30 off 36 balls. So that really, if even Harmanpreet couldn't quite work out how to master that and score runs off that, then that's really showing something. I think that Smriti's class is just like way out and above everybody else, and what a player! And deservedly the player that won the tournament for them there. Yeah. So good for her. And overall, I think we enjoyed that brief tournament. We all wish it could have been a bit longer, but I think that it almost certainly will be longer next year. The BCCI have committed, in theory, to 4 teams this year, but that didn't happen because of COVID. But I think they will move on to the 4 teams next year, and hopefully it will grow from there. So I enjoyed watching it. There were some handy timings for us because the games happened at a nice time of 2 in the afternoon.
Did,
so
yeah, keep those, please.
Keep that.
Quite like not having to get up in the middle of the night, don't you?
Yes.
Okay. I think my favourite moment from that final was that incredible piece of fielding by the Thailand player, Natakan Chantam. And I think it was probably one of the best bits of ground fielding I've ever seen. It was, lots of people were tweeting about it. Jared Kimber described it as, he said something like, this is what you do when you drop your ice cream. Because it was a kind of, almost like a leaping handstand onto the boundary to just kind of pull it back from what should really have been a certain boundary. It was an incredible bit of work.
Yeah, you were expecting one of those Strictly judges to hold up a thing saying 10 on it, weren't you?
That's true, yeah.
Strictly come fielding. It could happen, Raf.
Oh, it's a new concept.
It's the future.
Well, that would certainly have been a 10 out of 10, wouldn't it?
If any television producers are watching, we are contactable on the email address that follows this programme.
I think that in a way, the great thing about it was that it was by a player from Thailand, and we know that they're relatively new to women's cricket. They played in their first ever world tournament earlier this year, and many of those players haven't been playing cricket particularly long, and so that actually makes it even more impressive from that perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, when we spoke to their coach at the World Cup earlier this year, gosh, it feels like it could be 10 years ago because it was so long ago. Yeah. When we spoke to their coach, he really emphasised that fielding was something where he felt he could make a real impact, and where he could bring the players up to international class, even though they didn't have much competition otherwise, in order to kind of bring them up to that level. So he really felt that fielding was where he could make an impact. And so, some marks to him there as well for kind of pushing that, and obviously pushing the players to a remarkable level. So that's great stuff, yes.
Yeah, definitely. It was great that that a Thai player could get the chance to play in the Women's T20 Challenge, wasn't it? That, I suppose that, in a way, was one of the upsides of having it clash with WBBL and making some of those, the kind of your usual suspects not be available for it, is that it widened the opportunity for some of your slightly lesser known players to go and make a bit of a name for themselves, because that moment was certainly circulating on Twitter. And we've seen a couple of other bits of spectacular fielding in WBBL, haven't we?
We certainly have.
There was that extraordinary catch by Nat Sciver, just sort of. Well, do you want to talk about that a bit, Syd?
Oh well, I mean, I'm sure that all our viewers will have seen that on the YouTubes or the Twitter tubes or whatever they are. But reverse sweep from Tammy Beaumont, and Nat just leapt to her left and kind of plucked it out of the air goalkeeper style. So definitely one of the best catches I've ever seen. And deservedly been doing the rounds of YouTube and social media.
Absolutely, yeah. And a few people pointing out on Twitter that it was particularly impressive because it was her non-dominant hand. She's obviously a right-hander. I tweeted saying that I thought that it was probably the second best catch I've ever seen after that Fran Wilson one at Chelmsford against West Indies a couple of seasons ago.
Do you stand by that, Raf? Do you think it's still?
Yeah, I think I do. In a way, all these things are a bit subjective, aren't they? There has been a bit of debate about it on Twitter. I just brought it up. Former England player and coach Jane Powell saying that Fran got there with both hands and Nat had to reach with one hand, and it was her less dominant hand. So she thinks that probably Nat's one was more impressive. We had another comment from Sporting Statues saying that Wilson's one was probably better. Sciver's was a slightly nicer height, especially given that she's a taller player. However, it was less easy to see coming off the bat because when it's a cover drive, which the Wilson one was, you can see it all the way coming off the bat, whereas a reverse sweep you don't necessarily. It's a bit harder to pick up initially. So, debating back and forth about it, but there is no doubt that it's really wonderful to see these moments going viral on Twitter, and people talking about them and really recognising the fact that skills in women's cricket have developed so much. Do you think that fielding is the aspect of the game that's changed the most since you first started watching women's cricket, Syd?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that the overall standards have improved. I mean, there will always be spectacular catches. I remember, I've talked about it before in Vodcast, seeing an absolutely amazing catch by Maya Boucher back in about 2014 for Middlesex against Berkshire, where she dived high to her right and took a catch goalkeeper style again, a little bit of a similar catch to Nat's in some ways. So there'll always be those sparks of genius, and players have been doing that for a long time and will continue to. But overall, definitely the standards has improved. The standard of boundary fielding and things like that has improved. And we've seen players like Ashley Gardner for Australia and for the Sydney Sixers, and we've seen like Maddie Villiers for England has taken that to a new level over the last year or so. So, and things are continuing to improve, and we're really seeing the impact of that definitely starting to trickle down into the leagues as well.
I think it's one of the reasons why it's so important that these tournaments are on TV as well, isn't it? Because you really capture those moments then for posterity. So that Maya Boucher catch that you're talking about, I bet at the time actually you weren't very happy about it because she was taking it against Berkshire, so you're probably a bit cross, to be honest. But that's in your mind's eye, but nobody else is ever going to be able to see that again, unfortunately. Yeah. And it even happened with it's happened with quite a few kind of big moments over the years. You really wish that some of them had been captured. So it's great that the ones that now are happening are being captured, are then being shared widely on social media, as I say, which is so important almost from a kind of reputational perspective for women's cricket more broadly, that people get to see those moments and then can kind of watch them again and again and again, because when you see them live, it's actually hard to appreciate how wonderful some of them are. And another issue, just to change focus slightly, that's crept up this week has been the one about bubble fatigue. And Heather Knight has given an interview this week in which she's talked about, that being a bit of a concern, and for her as a player, actually being over in WBBL, it being quite a different experience this year. Obviously having to undergo that 14 period of quarantine initially when she got off the plane, and now being in the village and it being very different to normal years, being over playing in Australia. And we obviously also have heard that Sophie Eccleston has talked in interviews about the fact that she chose to go to the Women's T20 Challenge instead of the WBBL, where she would normally have gone, because of that period, or because of that concern about the longer quarantine period for Australia and being away for a longer period of time, and worries about bubble fatigue. So are you a bit concerned about that, Syd? Do you think we should be worried about that from a women's cricket perspective?
Well, to a certain extent, I think it's a little bit the case of be careful what you wish for, because what we all want for women's cricket is for women's cricket to kind of get to the same sort of level as men's cricket is at. And actually, if and when it does, then you're going to be living in a bubble still. So, Heather Knight can talk about, being, effectively shut away in a hotel room, not being able to just go out and have a walk around the town. Having to be, incredibly careful, having to be surrounded by security guards and shepherded from A to B. Welcome to Virat Kohli's life. That's the life that he lives every day because of the fact that he's, a superstar in that environment. He can't just, go out randomly and leave his hotel without being shepherded by security guards and things. So, at some stage, the women's game is going to find itself in a bubble, but I accept that it's perhaps a different kind of bubble. But a bubble is nonetheless something that you need to get used to. If you're going to be an elite sport going forwards, people are going to live in bubbles. So what do you think, Raf?
Well, yeah, I think I've got a bit of sympathy for their perspective, certainly, because I think that the difference between the Virat Kohli situation that you've just described is that ordinarily he'd be able to have his partner and people fly out and see him, and be able to be around people. And one of the things that Heather Knight talked about was the difficulties, or the kind of emotional difficulties of having to be away from her boyfriend for such a long period of time, not be able to see him. He'd normally, I think, fly out and see her during her time in the WBBL. So that makes it a bit different. And also it's the amount of money that you're making from the cricket, isn't it? Because Virat Kohli is, incredibly rich and is incredibly well financially rewarded for what he does. Whereas some of the women obviously aren't yet.
Yeah.
And so that's a bit of difference. I suppose my overall view when cricketers do talk about bubble fatigue is I do kind of feel a little bit like, well, and to be fair to her, Heather Knight has said this, that is what you have to do now as an international cricketer, because we're in a pandemic. It's not ideal for anyone. There are people going out to work every day and having to kind of almost risk their lives, so from a cricketing perspective, to have to spend some time in a bubble and some time in quarantine, actually your situation isn't as bad as many other people's. I know that, for example, I spent essentially a week by myself in a hotel room in Derby to cover the recent series, England v West Indies, and wasn't with you, wasn't really able to leave the hotel, or I was able to leave the hotel, but I didn't feel like I could without putting the kind of environment of the series at risk, and so I chose to do that because it was important for me that I carried on doing my job, and I suppose in a way that we, now they are professionals. For the women who are lucky enough to be able to play cricket as a career, this is a sacrifice they have to make, and hopefully it's a very temporary one, given that we're hearing really positive news now about vaccines and things like that. So that's everything this week. Hope you've enjoyed the Vodcast, and we will see you in a few days' time. Stay safe and well. Bye for now.
Bye.